you for that, and we thank you for our message tonight. We give you praise and glory through Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you, Bob.
Hear me? I think we're on. Okay, there we are. Right. It was great to be back again tonight, and I see you took my advice. Didn't miss the last night, because if you're going to miss a night, you should have missed the night before, right? All right. I'm going to tell you tonight, it's okay if you don't make it tomorrow night. But tonight's our last night. Now, before we get going too far, tonight's seminar is going to be titled Creation or Evolution. And basically, tonight's seminar, we're going to be talking about where did life come from. But before we go into that too far, remember I told you guys last night that I was going to tell you a little bit about my story, and I wanted to wrap that up. And what I told you last night is that as I was going through the public school system, I was a very logical-minded individual, so I wanted to see things, as they were, and I was taught about the facts of evolution, or what I assumed to be the facts of evolution, and how the Earth was billions of years old, and the universe was billions of years old, and dinosaurs lived multi-million years ago, and then man came about 3 million years ago, and it was very much a contradiction to the Bible. I struggled with that as I went through my Sunday school classes as a Lutheran when I was growing up, and by the time I was confirmed, I was given an option by my parents that if I wanted to continue to go to church, I can, but now that I've been confirmed, I'm old enough to make my own choice. And I chose not to go. And about the only time we'd ever go to church would be over Easter and over Christmas. And that was it. My mom continued to go every year. Every day, every week, she would always be at church, but as far as I was concerned, and even my brothers, we never went anymore after that. I became an atheist. And I really wondered, and there were many nights that I spent as I was growing up wondering if God really existed, even praying about it a little bit, and just not really feeling that anything is even possible because we knew all this information, and it's so completely contradictory to the Bible, then the Bible must not be true. That gets into being a bad situation for any individual. And you lose all hope. You don't have any future. And it affected me as well. But regardless to say, we'll talk about that a little bit more tonight, about how it affects individuals and how it affects our children as they grow up through the public school system and they're learning about evolution as a fact, and they don't get to hear the story of creation. Now, later on in my life, as I was a young man, I met a woman, and she was somebody I was interested in spending some time with at the time. So she happened to be a Seventh-day Adventist. And I was invited to a prophecy meeting as a Seventh-day Adventist. Now, I was still very much atheistic-minded. I did know some things about the Bible, not very much, and not as much as I thought I did. So thought I knew a lot more about the Bible with a Lutheran upbringing, but boy, I tell you, we never studied the Bible like an Adventist will study the Bible. But we went to a Bible prophecy meeting, and I heard a lot of things. And it was through that meeting I seen that there was some factual evidence that was being presented throughout the meetings, that everything that the Bible would prophesy lined up, and it fit historically. And I always enjoyed reading and learning more about history anyway, so it kind of hit with me. So for me as an individual, what I decided to do at that point was to make a decision, and I really needed to. I seen that the Bible was full of information that was true and factual from what I thought was just a bunch of stories. And I needed to make a choice. Now, I still had evolution, and I still had science, and I still had no answers when it came to creation versus evolution. But I looked at the rest of the story of the Bible, and I seen hope. And that's what I really seen in the Bible. And I seen in the prophecies, and I seen in that prophecy seminar, there was actually hope. There's actually a future for an individual. It wasn't just we grow up, we grow old, we die, and we're done. So with that, I took a step out in faith, and I decided to believe the Bible and to believe that it was true, regardless of where it was in the Bible, whether it was Genesis, whether it was Revelation, whether it was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It didn't matter. I decided to consider it to be true. Now, that works well when you tell yourself that the first day. But after a while, it gets to be a problem because I still had the science background. I still had a job where basically it was an intellectual job. It was studying, it was thinking all the time, and that was always a problem for me because you get your mind going and you start thinking on things, you get into a logical process, and you carry that on to other parts of your life. So I continued to pray about it, and I prayed a lot, and I said, my prayers were focused on, God, I know you're there and I know you exist, but you need to help me with this. And doors started open after that. I started having friends of mine that didn't even seem to be focused on the Bible in any way, shape, or form, that would say, hey, have you seen this video? Or, hey, have you heard about this guy? Or have you seen this book? And it would be talking about something about creation or evolution. And I started learning more and more. And it was that process of learning and learning that actually got me to the point where I could understand where the fallacies were in the evolution theory, where the assumptions were all made and they were treated as fact. And to find out later that the assumptions were wrong. And that's what we discovered here over these past couple nights, and we'll continue to discover tonight, is that there's a lot of assumptions that are made on the evolution theory that cannot stand up by themselves. They have to be treated as true, even though there's contradictory evidence out there all over the place. So for me, it was really just like Jesus has told us. Knock, ask, right? And it was basically that step of, I had to ask Jesus. First, I opened up the door. I let Jesus into my life, and I said, you know what, I don't understand it. I don't know between creation and evolution. It sounds like evolution is factual and everything else, but if there's something different, you got to show me. And I asked, and I continued to ask. And I allowed Jesus that opportunity to show me, but it took a step in faith first. And remember, we talked to you guys every night. We said, we're not trying to tell you what to believe. We're just trying to present you with the information. Because if somebody would have came up to me and told me, look, creation is true, and this is why it's true, and I believe this is true, I still had to work that out for myself. It's still a choice that I had to make as an individual. I can't make my choices based upon somebody else. And that's what it took for me, and it took a little while. But when I was able to make those choices, when I gathered the information for myself, I was able to make my own choice. Because so many times in the world today, we're taught by our parents, or we're taught by our teachers, or we're taught by somebody else, this is what you need to believe. And we can accept that, and we go on, and sometimes that's a bad choice. So we should always have the information first to decide what we believe. Now, tonight we're going to be talking a little bit more about the same information. Everything that we're going to talk about is scientific fact. These are numbers that are not in dispute in any way, shape, or form. And remember, we're not trying to tell you what to believe. We're just trying to give you the information to make up a decision for yourself. So tonight we do have some more questions. So we'll invite Brianne back up here, see if we can find out what's on everybody's mind tonight.
Yes. So our first question is, why does God say he will, at the end, banish the moon and shame the sun in Isaiah 24:23?
Isaiah 24:23. Isaiah 24 is a prophecy, actually. And let's take a look here real quick. 24:23, right?
Yep.
See if we can pull it up here. Here we go. Isaiah 24, verse 23. And it says, Then the moon shall be confounded, and the sun ashamed, when the Lord of hosts shall reign in Mount Zion and in Jerusalem, and before his ancients gloriously. Now, if we look through this chapter is actually talking about the devastation of the earth. This is God's second coming. And in this chapter, Isaiah is prophesying about God's second coming. And if you look a few verses ahead of it, you're going to see, And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall punish the hosts of the high ones that are on high, and the kings of the earth upon the earth. And they shall be gathered together as prisoners are gathered in a pit, and they shall be shut up in prison, and after many days they shall be visited. So what we're seeing here is not that Jesus comes to this earth, and he gathers up all the kings of the earth, and he puts them in prison. So this is prophetic that we're talking about. So the sun and the moon is not the actual sun and moon that we're talking about, but it's more of a prophecy. And what we could talk about this a little bit more, but I'd really suggest that you talk to either Pastor Ken or one of the elders here at the church, and they'll be able to explain the prophecy a little bit better for us.
All right, the second question is, are they governed by angels, and do we have info that angels govern the stars?
Are they governed by angels? So we're talking about the sun and the moon, and we don't see anything from a biblical standpoint that I'm aware of that the sun and the moon are actually being governed by the angels, or the stars are being governed by the angels. But we know that it's God that controls all things. And it's God that gives light to the sun. He gave the energy for the sun to be created. He gave the energy for the earth. He gave us everything that we have within the universe today, and it's God that controls it as the creator.
All right, our next question. Does science say how God got here when the planet was void of all matter?
Does science.
Does science?
Does science say that how God got here? And actually, most science, even creation scientists, they don't talk about how God got here, but we have to remember, as we learn in the Bible and we study through the Bible, we learn that God is omnipresent. God knows all things. He's not bound by time. He's not bound by any laws or anything else like that. So God may have been here at the forming of the earth. At the same time, he has been in many other places. We know that God can control all things at all times. So it doesn't say how God got here, but that's one of the mysteries of who God is. It's something that's well beyond our own capability of understanding, because it transcends any of the physical limitations that we have today. We can't go forward or back in time. We can't understand. We can't live outside of time. We can't be in multiple places at the same time. So it's really difficult to even understand who God is.
Okay, next question. Is not plutonium-218's presence in pre-Cambrian granite proof of a young Earth?
That's polonium,
Very young
yes.
Earth.
Polonium in granites. Now, there's a scientist by the name of Dr. Robert Gentry, and he covers this in a lot of detail. And what Dr. Robert Gentry talks about is polonium-218. Now, polonium, we actually had it on our screen last night. We talked about polonium. Polonium had a half-life of 3 minutes, and I said if I had a jar of polonium, after 3 minutes, half of that jar would be turning into lead, or turning into the next element, and we'd only have a half a jar left when we described half-lives. Now, the interesting thing is when we look in granites, and granites, remember, if we look at it from an evolutionary standpoint, rock is in a molten state, and all the daughter elements were supposed to come out of the rock, and we were able to prove that that never actually happened. But then the rock slowly cools over time, and it becomes hard. Anything that's radioactive would be able to work through a molten rock. The radio waves, or the radioactivity would be able to come through the rock when it's in a molten state. But when it hardens, it's like putting a case around anything radioactive. It's just like our nuclear reactors that we have. We have a hardened case around these reactors of concrete, layers and layers and feet of concrete to stop the radioactivity from getting through. But in a molten state, the rock, it could get through. Now, all of the radioactive atoms, they'll put out what's called a halo. And a halo is a little circle that goes around this atom, and it shows the radioactivity of that atom. Now, you can measure the distances and the widths of these halos, and you can determine what that material was that was actually pushing out that halo. So what Dr. Robert Gentry did is he was actually finding these halos in granite. So hardened granite actually showed a halo, and he was able to measure out the halo and say that this was polonium halos that were in the granite. So that means that granite had to be able to go from a molten state to a completely hardened state in less than 3 minutes, which is a very, very difficult thing for a rock to do in a natural process, but it's not a difficult thing for God to do, to create a rock in 3 minutes or even a multi-second.
Okay, the next question on that card was, as it was in the days of Noah, shall it be when Jesus comes? Were there 7 billion people around when the flood of Noah happened? Okay,
that question, as it was in the days of Noah, that's found a few different places in the New Testament. We find that in the Gospels, and it said, it's just, as it was in the days of Noah, so it shall be in the return of the Son of Man. So when we talk about the days of Noah, and we talk about Jesus' prophecy and saying, just as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be when God returns, we have a situation where we're looking at what was going on as a culture at the time of Noah. Now, when Noah was raised up, and when Noah had spoke to God, and God told Noah to build an ark, there was a reason for that, because the world was evil continually. It wasn't about the population, it was about the people of the world. And if you go to 1 Peter 3, you will find that Peter talks a little bit about that actually happening as well. And he talks more about not being anything other than people, but it being about the wickedness of the people at the time. And that's what God is referring to, as it was in the day of Noah, everybody was wicked continually. Now I think in 1 Peter, it talks about that, he mentions that the people were so evil that even though they were all offered safety in the ark, only 8 people chose to take the ark's route. So the world was so evil at that time, only 8 people followed God's word. And he said, just as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be at the end of time.
Okay. Is it true about the rate of dust accumulation on the moon? They can tell how old the moon is?
That is a topic that has come up over the years, that people say, okay, if we measure the amount of dust that's accumulated on the moon, that we can tell how old the moon is, because if we can measure how much dust is there, how much dust is added per year, we can reach a point where we can determine the age of the moon. And some people have used that as evidence of a young moon. However, there's a problem with that. And that's why we didn't even talk about it in here. The problem with that is it's just like a desert. It's like measuring a sand dune. Dust can change. Dust can be moved around. Now, we don't really have an atmosphere blowing things around or anything in there, but the measurement of the amount of dust that's on the moon has not been able to reflect in any way the age of the moon itself. And that's why we never talked about it in here. So there's just no evidence that actually supports that.
Okay, our last question. What about black holes?
What about black holes? Well, black holes, I guess maybe we should go back just a step. If we go back and we look at Genesis chapter 1, and we see that God created the heavens and the earth, and they were very good. They were good, and God created man, and man was very good, and he planted man in the Garden of Eden, and everything was perfect in this world. Throughout the universe, we had a perfect world. We lived on a perfect earth. We had a Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve were there. They were tending to the garden. Everything was good, and then sin came. And when sin came, something happened. So did death. So did destruction. Animals started to die. People now were going to die. Plants were going to die. And we see a state of decay that happened from that point of sin entering this earth. And we look at that, we look at a black hole, and black holes have been able to be witnessed by the scientists. They can pinpoint a black hole, and they do know that there's actually a black hole right now in our galaxy, and black holes come from the decay of stars. And basically, it's an implosion and an extreme amount of gravity that gets so strong that it actually pulls in light to go along with it, and that's why they call it a black hole. So a black hole is something that actually has gravity that's so strong that light gets pulled into the black hole, and that's why we can't see them, so we can only detect them by their gravitational pull. Now, that's also a result of death and decay that we see in our universe today. So did black holes exist? Did God create black holes in the beginning? I don't believe so, because it's a result of a death of a star, not a result of anything that's been created. Is that our questions?
Yep, that's it.
All right. Well, thank you again tonight for the questions. And I know we don't have the index cards tonight, so if you do have any other questions after tonight, just feel free to come up and talk to me. I'd be more than happy to answer anything I can. And we're going to move on, and we're going to start our series here. In the final night, creation or evolution, the origin of light itself. And remember, we have 3 different theories that we really focused on. A lot of people talk about a whole bunch of different types of theories, but there's really 3 main topics. There's evolution, there's theistic evolution, and there's creation. The evolution theory says that Earth formed 4.6 billion years ago, and chemical life came about 3.6 billion years ago, and mankind came about between 1 and 4 million years. I think the common accepted term for evolutionists today is about 4 million years. So that's evolution. Earth formed 4.6 billion years ago, and chemical life happened about 3.6. Now, theistic evolution says that Genesis 6 days are not literal days. They had the day age, the gap theory, and that God created man through evolution. So basically, it copies whatever evolution says, and it just says man is using that. We have some churches today that said evolution, man was evolved, and man evolved from an ape-like creature, and when the first man evolved, that's when God breathed into him an eternal soul. So there's a lot of different ways of looking at that from a theistic evolution standpoint, but it really is nothing more than evolution. Then we have the creation account, and the creation theory says that 6,000 years ago, God created the heavens and the earth, and he created them in 6 literal days. Now, remember, each of these theories are beliefs. We talked about this before, but each of these theories are strictly beliefs. None of them have been proven to be true, and we weren't there in the beginning to see them. And remember, the scientific method says that we have to be able to observe it. We have to have empirical evidence. In other words, we have to be able to reproduce it over and over again. We have to have repeatability and measurability. So they're beliefs in their truest sense of the form. Basically, these are theories, and that's why we call them theories. It's not the evolution fact, it's not the evolution law, it's the evolution theory, and it's the creation theory, because we can't recreate them. but we can look at all the evidence. So we can look at it from a scientific standpoint, but we also learn these are all very much beliefs, and they're very much religious from that standpoint as well, because people choose to believe in something they cannot see. And that's one of the definitions of a religion. So we need to look at all the evidence available if we're going to make our own decision. So let's take a look at some of the different meanings for the word evolution. And the word evolution has a lot of different meanings, but only one of these meanings is actually scientific. Now we have cosmic evolution, and cosmic evolution is the origin of space, time, and matter. In other words, the Big Bang. And we found out Friday night that the Big Bang had a lot of big problems, didn't it? We didn't know where the matter came from, we didn't know where the galaxies come from, we don't know where the stars came from, basically, we had no answers. And we had a lot of problems with the Big Bang, and even the evolution scientists themselves are saying the Big Bang is serious problems. So that's cosmic evolution. Cosmic evolution has not been proven to be true in any way, shape, or form. Then we also have stellar and planetary evolution. We just talked about that. That's the origin of the stars and the planets. And we've shown that we cannot even find out how one single star was formed. No one has ever seen a star form. Even though we talk about it, we looked at it, every explanation for how a star formed is actually proven wrong by true laws. Boyle's law proves that star formation cannot happen in a nebula. So then we have chemical evolution. Chemical evolution is the origin of higher elements from a lower element like hydrogen. And then we have organic evolution, the origin of life itself, and that's what we're going to talk about mainly tonight. So we're going to focus on these two right now, number 3 and number 4, chemical and organic evolution. So let's take a look at these. Now, the evolution model states that about 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth formed. And then chemicals formed in a primordial soup. And these chemicals bonded together to form molecules. And those molecules bonded together to make a living cell. So what it means is we take a whole lot of time, a whole lot of chance, and we're supposed to be able to create life. So before we go into this too far, I want to understand a little bit about the terminology that we're going to talk about. So first thing is atoms. We're going to talk about atoms. And atoms consider them to be the basic building block of life. So they're the basic unit of matter. And if we take some atoms and we put these atoms together, we can form a molecule. So if I can take 2 hydrogen atoms and I can take an oxygen atom and I can merge them together and get them all connected to each other, I create a water molecule. So we take these 3 atoms and we create a molecule with it. So now I can take these molecules that I've created and I can put a bunch of these together in a specific way, and I can create an amino acid. And amino acids are the building blocks of life. Amino acids are necessary for life. So if I take the right molecules and I arrange them in the right order, I can wind up with an amino acid. Now I can also take a bunch of amino acids, and if I arrange these in a specific order, I can create proteins. So this is our basic understanding. So we go from atoms to molecules to amino acids, and then amino acids we can go to proteins. So let's take a look at the evolution theory on the origin of life. It says the Earth formed 4.6 billion years ago, and then it rained on the rocks. And that rain caused the chemicals to combine in what we call this primordial soup. And that's what, if you ever heard that story, the primordial soup. So basically the rain goes on the rocks, and the rain starts washing the chemicals and mixing them up together in a little puddle. And these chemicals get all mixed up together, and they're in a little puddle, they're in a little bit of water, and then chemical life is formed from this primordial soup that resulted from the rain and the lightning hitting it. And the lightning is what's giving it the energy to form, because you have to have energy to get anything to move. So we have this the story is, we have the earth, it rained on the rocks, the chemicals from the rocks gathered together in a little puddle, lightning strikes, and it creates life. So in other words, what evolution says is we come from a rock. That's exactly what it says. So Stanley Miller was a scientist, and Stanley Miller decided to prove this theory to be true. So Stanley Miller and another scientist by the name of Urey started an experiment, and they did this in 1953. It's called the Miller-Urey experiment, and this was to allow them to create amino acids, which are the building blocks of life. So what they did is they took a little apparatus and they created an input chamber. And with that input chamber, they put atmospheric conditions into the input chamber. So they put the different types of particles of the atmosphere, and they put them together, like the nitrogen and and ammonia and different things like that, and they put that into the input chamber, and then they also had a vapor chamber, a water vapor chamber. So they created some water vapor, so they put a little Bunsen burner underneath a little apparatus that was holding water to create the water vapor. So now you have the atmospheric conditions of the planet Earth 3.6 billion years ago. You have the different things from the atmosphere, the different molecules from the atmosphere, and you have the water vapor, and they bring it around to a spark chamber. That's going to simulate the lightning. So they bring it to a spark chamber, they strike it with electricity, they simulate the lightning striking the primordial soup, and then they pull it through a condenser to let everything cool back down again, and they bring it over to a trap. And then they pull out any amino acids they can gather. There's a reason for that. See, because there were some problems with this experiment. First, the problem that they have is they were using what's called a reducing atmosphere. See, they put no oxygen into this chamber. There's a specific reason for that. The oxygen prevents amino acids from forming, and it destroys any that are around. So you can't have oxygen and form an amino acid at the same time. You have to eliminate oxygen. So they had a reducing atmosphere, an atmosphere with absolutely zero oxygen. Now, we do have evidence of that. The atmosphere, if you look at it from an evolutionary standpoint, we can look at the rocks that they're dating, and even though we talked about the dating method, if we look at the rocks, the granites, the basalts, and everything else that should have been around from the creation of the earth, we can see that there was oxygen present even at the times those rocks were forming. So every indication we have is there's always been oxygen on this earth. But they had to remove the oxygen anyways, because by keeping the oxygen in there, they knew they would never create an amino acid. So research actually showed that the oxygen was very much present, and that the gases that were actually used for this experiment were not abundant at all. Some of the gases that they're used weren't abundant in the atmosphere, and they're not abundant in the atmosphere today, but they're needed for this experiment to work. So here's a problem that we had. One is we have a trap. Now, having this trap sitting in there allows them to isolate the amino acids from the lightning. See, what happens is when they bring it around to the spark chamber and they hit the electricity, hit the lightning strike into the spark chamber, they can create some amino acids with having the right type of atmospheric conditions. But if they hit it with another strike of lightning, it destroys the amino acids better than it does make them. So they had to be able to remove the amino acids that they were creating faster. They'd remove them before they could do another strike. And that's why they had the trap in there. Now, in reality, if this really happened, if there was a little puddle sitting there and a strike of lightning got a couple amino acids to form, the next strike of lightning, instead of creating more amino acids that were necessary, would have destroyed every ones that were in there. That was one of the problems. Now, here's what wound up happening. Here's the result. They were able to make amino acids. And what they did is they made a small amount of the amino acids that are necessary to support life. There's over 20 amino acids that are necessary just for basic life. And they created less than half of those. That's all they could ever create. They couldn't create enough to even start basic life. But they also created both right-hand and left-hand amino acids. And if we look at the picture up here, it shows a right-hand and a left-hand amino acids. Now, what's so important about right-hand and left hands? Left-hand amino acids are what's required for life. But one right-hand amino acid will be lethal to life. It can destroy it. So if you're trying to put the amino acids together in a chain, one right-hand amino acid, then it's destroyed. And they were creating both. So a lot like the matter and antimatter, they come together, they destroy each other. This is what we're seeing here. You can't have right-hand amino acids, but they're creating them anyways. So here were the conclusions of the experiment. Now, the Miller-Urey experiment assumed that the Earth had a reducing atmosphere, that it contained water, it contained hydrogen, it contained ammonia, and it contained methane, but no oxygen. And that was a problem. Our primitive atmosphere, even the evolution scientists say that there was never a time where there wasn't an oxygen-rich atmosphere. So, Origin of Life Science actually chose to ignore the evidence for oxygen in early Earth atmosphere. Oxygen is an oxidizing agent, and it would inhibit any chemical evolution. However, oxygen is necessary for life. Still, the Miller-Urey experiment also assumed the wrong gas mixture to make the experiment work. In other words, they used a gas mixture that had nothing to do with our atmospheric conditions, and they produced the wrong amino acids. They produced right-hand amino acids. So what do we actually find out from the experiment? Life cannot start with oxygen. If we have oxygen in the atmosphere, we can't create life this way. But life cannot exist without oxygen either. So we still need the oxygen. So what we found out is we need oxygen for life, but we can't have oxygen to create it. That's the only thing we actually found out from the Miller-Urey experiment. Now, there was a debate that was going on by a creation scientist and an evolution scientist. And they were debating, and the creation scientist brought up some of these issues on the Miller-Urey experiment. And he was talking about the problems with the experiment to the evolution scientist. The moderator stopped the debate at that time, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a member of the audience that probably would be able to answer this question much better than the other person in the debate." In this case, it was the evolutionary scientist. He said, "Dr. Stanley Miller is here with us, the guy who created the experiment." And they asked Dr. Miller about this, and the response was, the creationists is correct. So the Miller-Urey experiment never did create life. It never proved that life could exist, could be created. All it did is created amino acids in a very specific situation that was unlike anything on this earth. So what do the scientists actually say about this? The likelihood of life having occurred through a chemical accident is, for all intents and purposes, 0. Now, Sir Frederick Hoyle stated the possibility of life starting by chance. He said that if we took 10 to the 50th power blindfolded persons, now think about the number 10 and add 50 zeros behind it. In other words, the best way to visualize this is say, think of everybody who's ever lived on this earth for the last 6,000 years. And they're all alive here on this earth at the exact same time. Blindfold every one of these people. Give them a scrambled up Rubik's Cube, put it in their hand, and every single person that ever lived on this earth gets the Rubik's Cube solved at the exact same instant. That's the likelihood of, and what he says, that's the chance of arriving by random shuffling of just one of the many bipolymers on which life depends. There's 10 billion possible scramblings of a Rubik's Cube. So the likelihood of life starting by chance is absolutely 0. There's more quotes. The simplest living cell could not have arisen by chance. The origin of life is also a stubborn problem with no solution in sight. So just like we've seen before with some of these other issues with the stars and the galaxies and everything else, chemical evolution, the forming of life through amino acids, through the Stanley-Miller experiment, is not possible. But we had another definition of evolution in here, and one that's called macroevolution, and that's changing from one kind into another. That's where we see that the animal became a fish and it went to an amphibian and so on and so forth. If you want to think of evolutionary terms for animals, think of the word farm. Fish, amphibian, reptile, mammal. That's how they say animals evolved. They started as fish, went to amphibians, became reptiles, and then became mammals. But this is what that's called macroevolution. That's changing from one kind of an animal to another kind of an animal. And then we have something called microevolution. That's the last definition. Microevolution is variations within a kind. So it's still the same animal, it's still the same type of animal, it just looks a little different than the other animal. And that's the one definition of evolution that's actually scientific, and that's actually true. That one has been observed, and we observe it all the time. We always see variations. Here's some tiger cubs. Each one of these cubs came from the same mother. They were born at the same litter, and they all have different colors. That's variations within a kind. That's called microevolution. So all we see, that's what the scientists call it. That's all we see today. We see variation with the kind. Now we can take this even a step further, and here's a leopon. A leopon is a cross between a leopard and a lion. Now they're both cats. And these cats can mate, and they can produce offspring, and there we have a leopon. Now, years and years ago, as an engineer, I was called out to consult on a project that was going on at Chrysler out in Detroit. And when I was driving out there, before I left to drive out there, I was talking to one of the people at the company that I worked for, and they were telling me that when I get out there, be careful about the liger. There was a liger that escaped from the zoo, and it was loose, and it was last seen somewhere near the hotel I was heading to. And this guy was kind of a practical joker, so it's like, yeah, okay, I'm not worried about, a liger. And I asked him, what's a liger? And he said it was a cross between a lion and a tiger. And he was from the Detroit Zoo, and the hotel wasn't all that far away from the Detroit Zoo, and it had been seen, I think it was like 5-6 blocks away from the hotel. So and it was a long drive, and as I got into Detroit, I turned on the news, and I was listening to the radio, and sure enough, on the radio, it talked about the liger was still loose. So it was a cross between a lion and a tiger, and they're very much there, but it's still a cat. So we see this all over the place. We see cats come in different shapes, sizes, and so do dogs. We have seen all kinds of variety of dogs. We see big dogs, we see little dogs. We see, the little poodles, and we see the big Siberian Huskies, and we see the greyhounds, and we see the St. Bernards, and they all look very different from each other, but they're still a dog, aren't they? So at the end of the day, it's still all the same kind. In fact, if we look here in BBC article, it says it looks as if current dogs come from just 3 original founding females. From a scientific standpoint, from zoology standpoint, they say all the dogs that exist today came from just 3 founding females. Now they're getting pretty close here. We had 2 on the ark, right? Male and a female. So all we needed is 1. We didn't need 3. And then they say dogs today come in shapes and sizes, but scientists believe they evolved from just a handful of wolves tamed by humans less than 15,000 years ago. They're getting even closer. They dropped down that number to about 4,000 years, and they got it. That's the 2 that came off the ark, right? So they're getting even closer. Now, variations happen. We see microevolution all the time around us. We see variations. We see different colored birds. We see cardinals and we see hummingbirds, but they're still birds. And they all have limits. We're never going to be able to breed a bigger pig the size of an elephant. It's never going to happen. We're never going to be able to breed cows the size of elephants. There's always a limit to it. And here's some quotes on this. Most bioevolutionists will tell you that macroevolution is just microevolution over longer periods of time. And this is dreaming. The central question of the Chicago Conference was whether the mechanisms underlying microevolution can be extrapolated to explain the phenomena of macroevolution. The answer can be given as a clear no. Now, this came from the book Science, volume 210. And what they're saying here is that scientists, evolutionary scientists, are saying, well, we see microevolution, we see variations. And all we need to do is just see those variations, we extrapolate over long periods of time, and eventually the variations will get to the point that it creates another animal. That's what they say macroevolution is. So they had big discussions on this in the Chicago Conference, which is a scientific conference discussing this particular mechanism itself. All the scientists there said it just can't happen. It's not going to work. So, what about mutations, though? Now, we see variations, but we say scientists like to say, evolution scientists say, it's the mutations that change from one form to another. So every once in a while, we see an animal that has mutations, a frog with an extra leg, or an animal with an extra leg, or something like that, and we see these mutations that happen. They say mutations are a good example of evolution, because if we get a mutation, it's a beneficial mutation, we continue to go on, and eventually it becomes another form of animal. So let's take a look at what the scientists have to say about this. No matter how numerous they may be, mutations do not produce any kind of evolution. See, they rearrange existing information, but they don't increase the genetic complexity. They don't add new information to an animal. It just rearranges what's already there, and in many cases, it loses information. So here's some of the scientific quotes on it. In all the reading I've done in the life sciences literature, I've never found a mutation that added information. All point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information, not increase it. And that's what we see with the mutation. It reduces the information, it doesn't add to it. But what's usually brought up is bacteria. What about bacteria? Bacteria should be a good evidence of evolution, because that's a beneficial mutation, because sometimes bacteria have mutated, and when they mutate, they become more resistant. So let's take a look at the bacteria. It says, does bacteria become resistant to drugs? Now, evolution has long pointed to that as being a beneficial benefit. See, what happens is mutations in the bacteria sometimes make the bacteria resistant to antibiotics. So those are the germ-killing drugs. So here's an example. To destroy a bacterium, the antibiotic streptomycin attaches to a part of a bacterial cell called ribosomes. Now, mutations of the bacteria can sometimes cause a structural deformity in the ribosome, and when that happens, the antibacterial drug cannot attach to that ribosome, and when it can't attach to the ribosome, it can't destroy the bacteria. Therefore, the bacteria has a beneficial mutation. But in reality, what happens is that bacteria that has gone through that mutation is not any stronger than the other bacteria around it. In fact, it's actually weaker. And without the antibiotics, it drug, not by a gaining of information, but by a loss of information, and a drug that was designed to go after that particular type of information. That's all it was. So here's an example of some mutations that we can see. And you can see whether or not these mutations were actually beneficial or not. Here we have sheep with very short legs. It's a form of mutation, and it can be pretty useful for a farmer that has to gather up his sheep. But if these sheep exist out in the wild and the wolf comes along, they're not going to be able to run away. Every single one of them is going to get killed. Here's a two-headed sheep, two-headed lamb. And as you can see, no new information is being added. It's just being rearranged. That's all that's happening. That's not going to create a better animal. In fact, we have scientists that spent some time studying fruit flies. And when they studied fruit flies, the reason why they wanted to study fruit flies is they wanted to show that mutations can create a new form of animal. Fruit flies is a great example to use, and it's a great animal to use for that kind of a study because of the short lifespan of a fruit fly. You can have generation upon generation upon generation in weeks and months rather than years and years. So you can go through it. So what they did is they took fruit flies and they zapped the fruit flies with radiation. They kept bombarding them with different types of radiation to get mutations to develop in the fruit flies and then see how those mutations could carry on. They wound up with flies that had no wings. They wound up with flies that had 4 wings, curved wings, all kinds of different things, but what they always produced was nothing more than a fly. A mutated fly, but it was always a fruit fly. Now, the conclusion that the scientists came up with wasn't that evolution through mutation does not occur. The conclusion was that fruit flies have already evolved as far as they can. That was the result. So fruit flies, it just doesn't work on them anymore. They've already gone through all their evolutionary process. It's not going to get any further. So here we have a textbook, a biology textbook, and it says, normal fruit flies have 2 wings. The mutant has 4 wings. This rare mutation, like most mutations, are harmful. Beneficial mutations are the raw material for natural selection. They talk about beneficial mutations, but they'll never be able to show a beneficial mutation because one doesn't exist. And they say it's the raw material for natural selection. So let's talk about natural selection here a little bit. Evolution says that natural selection and mutation are the tools that are used to create a new species. Now, the process of natural selection, we need to understand that a little bit. If we look at natural selection, what natural selection is that as something changes, something adapts, it becomes stronger, and it's more apt to survive. And if it survives, then that mutation or that change will carry on through the species until eventually it'll carry on and create a new kind of animal. That's what the idea of natural selection. But here's some quotes on it. Creationists have no arguments with natural selection. We thought of it first. It's only a conservative process that removes defective organisms and keeps the species strong. Now, a quote from Edward Blythe, 24 years before Darwin's Origin of Species, is actually who that was. 24 years before Darwin's Origin of Species, it was already talking about natural selection. They said, no, that's not a problem. Natural selection has already been around. Here's what happens. Think of natural selection in this way. Let's say you have a seal, and a seal is born, and it has a mutated fin, or a flipper. And with that mutated flipper, it's not going to be able to swim very fast. And because it can't swim very fast, it can't swim away from the shark, and it gets killed by the shark. And now that mutation is not going to be carried on into the gene pool. That's natural selection. So the shark is the natural selection process in that particular case. Anytime there's a mutation, if that mutation doesn't help, it's going to destroy the animal, and then that mutation is taken out. That's what natural selection is. So what do the evolutionists have to say about that? Natural selection may have a stabilizing effect, but it does not promote speciation. In other words, it does not create new species. It is not creative force, as many people have suggested. Natural selection can act only on those biological properties that already exist. It cannot create properties in order to meet adaptational needs. A good example of natural selection is like a factory. If you have a factory that produces cars, and as a factory is producing cars, it makes a car, and then it goes through what's called quality control. Quality control checks the tires, checks the brakes, checks everything else, makes sure everything works properly. That's natural selection, that quality control. So when the car comes in and it has a mutation, it has a problem with it, somebody forgot to put in a windshield, it'll get rejected. Somebody forgot to put a tire on it, it's going to get rejected. That's what natural selection is. It rejects anything that's wrong. But have you ever looked at the statement about natural selection? Have you ever heard of the statement of natural selection? Natural selection is also termed survival of the fittest. But that's actually circular reasoning, just like we talked about the other night with the rocks. The fossils date the rocks, but the rocks date the fossils. It's the exact same thing. Why did it survive? Because it was the fittest. How do you know it's the fittest? Because it survived. It's circular reasoning in its bare form. So that's what natural selection is. So going from microevolution to macroevolution just doesn't work, and it doesn't work through mutation. Mutations, natural selection actually eliminates mutations being able to be carried on. So let's talk about the evolution of life itself. Now we talked about how natural selection doesn't really work. We talked about mutation, but let's talk about how species evolved over billions of years ago. Darwin says that species evolved over billions of years from a common ancestor. That's known as Darwin's origin of species. And it's a commonly held belief in evolution that species evolved over millions and millions of years, and it's said to be shown in the fossil record itself. We talked about the geologic column, the big fossil record. And we look at what the fossil record is, and it says, okay, we should see this form, and then we should see an intermediate link, and then we should see it creating a new form, and we should see a new form and a new kind, and it should branch out, and it should grow like a big tree. That's what the fossil record should show for evolution. Here's what Darwin himself wrote in the book Origin of Species. He said, "Why is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain. And this is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory." In other words, even Darwin said, we don't have the missing links. They're not there. They should be all over the place. We should be stumbling over them, and we don't. So if we have no intermediate links, what do the scientists have to say about this? There is no question that such gaps exist. A big gap appears in the beginning of the Cambrian explosion over 500 million years ago, when great numbers of new species suddenly appeared in the fossil record. Goes on, however, we have virtually no evidence in the fossil record or elsewhere for any of the changes proposed during this immensity of time, but the public hears nothing of this problem. So we talked about what's called the Cambrian explosion, and here's what the Cambrian explosion is, where we look into the fossil record and we look at the geological columns, even though we got the missing columns in the flipped upside down layer, where we see all the fossils together. That's called the Cambrian explosion. It's the explosion of life at the Cambrian level. There's a Cambrian and Precambrian period that evolution scientists refer to. That's before life and after life. And we see this big explosion of all the different types of animals, all the different kinds, all appearing all at once, all in the same strata in the earth, with no intermediate links before them, no ancestry before them. They just are all there at once. It's like a big explosion. Here's what it should look like. According to the Darwin model, what we should be seeing is we should be seeing relatively few animals, and then it should be branching out, creating more and creating more and creating more until we reach up to the point where we get all the animals that we have today. But what we actually see is nothing before that, and all the animals being formed and existing all at the same time. They're all in the same layer. They're all in the same rocks. They're all there together. All the species are there that we have today, and so are ones that don't even exist anymore. There was no creation of species over time. They're all there. In fact, what we see in the records and we see through life today is that the amount of animals that existed back at the Cambrian explosion time are even more than we have today. We haven't seen a growing number of animals, we've seen a declining number of animals because of extinctions. So, let's take a look at a couple quotes on this. The Cambrian explosion is not just a case of all the major animal phyla appearing at about the same place in the geological column. It is a situation of no ancestors to suggest how they might have evolved. What conclusion could we make from that? All the animals all of a sudden just appeared at once. Sounds a lot like day 6, doesn't it? So, take a look at this. This is a tree of life. Living things are all very different. That's one thing that we can conclude. We know that the fossil record shows that the basic differences appear at the very lowest levels. In other words, all the kinds already existed. It's not over millions of years for them to come into existence. They were all there. There's no fossil evidence connecting the Cambrian animals to organisms preceding them. There's actually no history of any gradual divergence of any of the animals. The Cambrian explosion itself gives rise to most of the animal phyla that are alive today, as well as some that are now extinct. So what do the scientists actually have to say about these facts? I fully agree with your comments, and this is an interesting one. This is Colin Patterson, and he's a paleontologist at the British Museum of Natural History in London. He was the author of the museum's general text on evolution. He wrote a book, and this is a response to his book, and he wrote a letter back to the response of his book that he wrote, and he said, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of any direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I'll lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one can make a watertight argument. He said there is absolutely no missing links. There's no intermediate link between one animal and another. If he had it, if he knew of it, it would have been in the book, just like any other scientist. They would have been very proud of that. So, what do we see when we look in the textbooks? When we look in these textbooks and we look for this stuff, what do we actually see in the textbooks? Has anybody here ever heard of a guy named Ernst Haeckel? He was an interesting fellow. He said that the turning point in his thinking was when he read Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of Species, in 1860. Now, here's what Ernst Haeckel actually committed to science. He was an embryologist, and he studied embryos. And he drew up pictures of the different stages of the life cycle of an embryo. And if you look at the pictures, he's showing these pictures as all the different embryos we can see there. And he said all the embryos go through an evolutionary change. They go through a life cycle. As an embryo grows inside of its mother's womb, it goes through an evolutionary process. They all start out like a fish, and then they start to change. The fish stay the fish, but the amphibians, they change and they adapt as an embryo, and they resemble an amphibian, and they're born. And then the other ones, they continue to go from a fish to an amphibian to a reptile state, and then they're born. And the mammals start out as a fish, they go through an amphibian, they go to a reptile, and they go to a mammal form. And then they're all born. So whether it's a fish, a salamander, a turtle, a chicken, or a rabbit, or a human, which is shown in all these pictures, they all go through that similar evolutionary process. But there was a problem with the drawings. There was a problem. He didn't show the real examples. He made them up. He actually made it up because he wanted to prove evolution to be true, so he just drew up his own drawings. We see Ernest's drawings on top, and we see their actual real-life embryos on the bottom. They're very, very different from each other. They don't resemble any evolutionary process at all. Now, he was brought up on charges at the university that he worked at, and they found him guilty of fraud. And here's what his response was. He said, a small percentage of my embryonic drawings are forgeries, those namely for which the observed material is so incomplete or insufficient as to fill in and reconstruct the missing links by hypotheses and comparative synthesis. And he goes on, he said, I should feel utterly condemned were it not that hundreds of the best observers and biologists lie under the same charge. He's saying, I lied. I should feel condemned, but so does everybody else. They're all lying about this. Now, here's the problem that we have with this. Still in our textbooks today. Those actual drawings, here's an evolutionary analysis textbook, it's a college textbook, and there's the drawings in that textbook today. Now, way back in 1800s, he was found guilty of fraud, that these drawings were forgeries, and they still have them in our textbooks in the year 2000. If it's a fake, why is it still there? This is what the textbook writers actually responded to about the questions on why those drawings are in their textbooks. As such, if textbooks use the drawings at all, it's as a historical example and as a way to illustrate the concept in such a way that students are able to grasp it immediately. Even if the drawings are fraudulent, they can still be used for this purpose because the concept they illustrate is by no means fraudulent. So in other words, said the drawings are fakes, but they work so well to get you to understand that how evolution is, we keep them in there. Because evolution is true, so we just use them anyway. That's exactly what they said. Now, that's not the only thing that we find in the textbooks. There's the peppered moth experiments, and we'll see the peppered moth experiments in the textbooks all the time. Most pepper moths were considered to be light-colored in the early part of the 19th century, but then we had something that happened, the Industrial Revolution, and after the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of heavy pollution in the cities during the Revolution, and they became more predominantly melanic or dark-colored. So we had these light-colored pepper moths, and then after the Industrial Revolution, the trees started getting dark, and the moths adapted to it, and they went through an evolutionary change, and they went from light-colored to dark colors. This was called Kettlewell's moth experiment. And Bernard Kettlewell performed some experiments that suggested the predatory birds ate light-colored moths when they became more visible on the pollution-darkened tree trunks. Here, that natural selection was actually playing a role in the survival of the fittest, and it was creating a new species, a dark-colored moth rather than a light-colored moth. Now, the biology textbooks actually illustrate this example of natural selection working on the evolution with photographs showing two varieties of the moths, but here's the problems. The percentages that were predicted by the theory didn't materialize in different areas of England. Some areas maintained melanism increased even after the pollution control. So when things got lighter again, they continued to get darker. But it was later determined that the tree trunks aren't even the natural resting place of the peppered moth. They don't sit on the tree trunks. Moths normally rest underneath the side of narrow branches. So they weren't sitting on the tree trunks that were light-colored or dark-colored, and they weren't standing out for the birds to eat them. The moths were manually placed in their positions for the experiments. The photographs were actually all staged. So, but still in textbooks today. And here's another one that's in the textbook. Have you ever seen that picture? That's a good picture in the textbook. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about this drawing. This drawing actually formed before there was any so-called evidence. So there was no missing links, there was no discussion of missing links when that drawing was actually first being put together. This was the idea that came about when Darwin's time about, well, we probably came from ape-like creatures. First they said we probably came from monkeys, so then they started working. Now they say it's ape-like creatures, that modern ape and man all came from a common ancestor. But at the time they're saying, well, we probably came from the apes, so they started drawing the apes and they put them together and then they went out looking for fossils, is what happened. So that was always there. It's been reproduced in most biology textbooks, and it's in most of the museum exhibits you'll see around the world, and numerous fossils were discovered that actually appeared to be a transitionary link or a missing link in the evolutionary chain that leads to today's human beings. So after they had this picture, after they had the photographs, and they said, okay, here's what probably happened, then they started trying to find the fossils that would match up to that, and that they started finding these fossils. Here's the fossils that they started finding. Neanderthal man. Neanderthal man was supposed to be a missing link at one time, and it was determined that it's just another man. Then we had Java man. Java man was an artificial construct. Java man didn't exist. Now, you know who found Java man? Ernst Haeckel's student. The guy who faked the drawings, he faked Java man. He took a gibbon skull and he took a human thigh and he stained them to make them look old, and he said he dug them up in the area and he found the missing link. That was Java man. Then we had Piltdown man. Piltdown man was a hoax as well. They took an orangutan jaw, they stained it, and they filed down the teeth to make it look more human, and then they took a human skull bone, they stained that, and then they buried it, and then they pulled it back up. That's where we got Piltdown man. Now, Nebraska Man was the one and only missing link that was found in North America. And they never tried to find another missing link in North America after this guy. See, an archaeologist was digging in Nebraska and he found a tooth. And when he found that tooth, he showed it to an evolutionary scientist, or was looking at that truth and was saying, you know what, this could be the missing link. And we had in our textbooks during the time, we had Nebraska Man, and we had Nebraska Woman, and we had the Nebraska family, and they had pictures of all these people in the textbooks. Some of you might even remember them from your school days, that they actually had pictures of Nebraska Man in the textbook. It was the whole family, and they drew all those pictures from one tooth, until a zoologist seen the tooth and said, that's just a pig. That was an extinct pig's tooth that created Nebraska Man. So it went through the textbooks, it went through everywhere, and it's been a big embarrassment for North America, for the United States as a result. Because we created a man based out of a pig's tooth. Then we have Ramapithecus, which was nothing more than an orangutan, and we have Lucy, probably one of the most famous ones lately, was Lucy. Lucy was make-believe. Lucy didn't really exist. If you look at the papers for Lucy, what they found with Lucy, the archaeologists that found Lucy, what they found was they found a little monkey, type of a gibbon, I think if I remember right. They found part of it, and then it was a mile or 2 miles away and about another 150 feet down deeper into a deeper level of soil, they found the other part that had more resemblance of a human walking gait. So at least they knew how Lucy died. She went through a violent explosion that sent part of her body a couple miles away. So that's actually how Lucy's been considered, and no talk has ever been found on Lucy that she was a missing link anymore after the papers were studied. It was caught on by the media, and it was the media that did it. It was the National Geographic Channel, the History Channel. They were all advertising, the missing link has been found, and they were talking about Lucy, and eventually Lucy died down when they figured out what it really was. And that's what we see all the time. So we see all these different animals, all these different things that they say, here's the missing link, here's the missing link, here's the missing link. And then somebody looks at it and says, no, this isn't. That's just a pig. And that's what continues on. So what do the scientists have to say about that? Some scientists have correctly stated that to take a line of fossils and claim they represent linealogy is not a scientific hypothesis that can be tested, but an assertion that carries the same validity as a bedtime story. Amusing, perhaps even instructive, but not scientific. It says, carries the same validity as a bedtime story, trying to find these missing links. See, evolution has no scientific validity, and it has nothing more than a religion that requires us to ignore truth to believe in it. So they keep looking for an answer. They keep looking for an answer, and it requires us to ignore truth to believe in something that's been proven to be wrong. That's what evolution really is. The only advantage to evolution as a religion is that it'll allow you to fool yourself into believing that there's no consequences for your actions. That's the only advantage I've ever seen in evolution. I don't have to be accountable for my actions to anybody else. I don't have a higher power to answer to anymore. That's the only thing you get out of evolution. But there's a lot of devastating effects that evolution brings. You know, this belief has been brought into our society, and when I grew up in it myself, and I seen this belief, and when I started believing in evolution and I started following it, and I became more atheistic, as I did that, I found out something. I found out that life had no more meaning. Life had no more purpose. Life had nothing to look forward to. You live, you die, you're done. That's it. That's all it was. Now, in 1959, President Eisenhower asked Congress for $1 billion for the promotion and publication of the new science of evolution. So you remember right around that time, 1959, we were having a big struggle with some other nations, particularly Russia. And with the struggle with Russia, Russia was beating us. They were better in science than we were. They were better in math than we were. They were better in everything from a educational standpoint. The Tower of Academia in Russia was much higher than it was here in the United States. And they were concerned about it. But Russia was a communist country. They rejected religion, and they promoted evolution. So what President Eisenhower did and what Congress did is they focused on putting evolution into our textbooks. They said, we got to teach our children today evolution so we can catch up. So in 1959, they asked for it. By 1961, they had increased the amount of words in the textbook. So the average textbook, if you look at the textbooks during the time frame, the approximate amount of words in the textbooks that were available for the students at that time were around 2,000 to 3,000 words that focused on the theory of evolution. By 1961, they increased it to 26,819 words. And by 1963, it increased it even further to 33,089 words that were focused on promoting the theory of evolution. Now, there was a decline after that, but the decline after 1963 wasn't because they pulled evolution out of the textbooks. It's because they pulled words as a whole out of the textbooks and put in more pictures. The amount of evolution, the percentage of evolution discussion in the textbooks still increased even after 1963. But we have that dividing line in there. From 1959 up to 1963, it went from hardly any discussion of evolution in their textbooks to completely focused on evolution. What were those textbooks telling us? You are an animal and you share a common heritage with an earthworm. Holt Biology textbook, 1994. What they tell us is that we are nothing more than animals. We have no reason to exist. We just exist because of a random chance. We're just here because that's the way it happened. We're going to be here for a little while, and then we're not going to exist anymore. There's nothing you can do about it. That's all that textbook ever teaches you. What were the results of being taught that? As a child going through the education system, what are your results? What do you think for yourself after that happens? Percentage of teens, girls, who had premarital sex before and after 1963. Sexually transmitted diseases before and after 1963. Birth rates of unwed girls from the ages of 10 to 14 years old before and after 1963. And the pregnancies themselves went up 553% because abortions were available. Out-of-wedlock births as a percentage of all births before and after 1963. Fatherless homes, accounting for 53% of teenage mothers, 63% of youth suicides, 71% of high school dropouts, 85% of the youth that are in prison, 90% of the homeless and runaway children. Unmarried couples living together before and after 1963. Prior to 1977, the unmarried couples that were living together were such a small group, they only took a census on them every 10 years. Divorce rates before and after 1963. If there's no accountability anymore and you aren't here for any reasons, what does it matter? Here's where it gets sad. Teen suicide rates. Child abuse up 2,300%. Illegal drug use up 6,000%. Violent crimes up 995%. And all the while that's happening, SAT scores plummet. Nobody cared to learn anymore. All they were learning is evolution. All they were learning is how bad the world is, and all they were learning was that you don't matter. That's all they learned. So what did they do with the SATs? They dumbed them down so the scores could get back up. Instead of looking at the reason why the SAT scores were dropping, they changed the SATs so the scores could go back up. So do we have any other choice? We do have a choice, don't we? We can choose to believe, but we need all the evidence to make that choice. Now, I want to read the words of one of the greatest presidents that I consider to be around in this country. It was Abraham Lincoln, and he said, "The Bible contains an immense amount of evidence as to its authenticity. Let us treat the Bible fairly. If we had a witness on the stand whose general story was true, we would believe him even when he asserted facts of which we had no evidence. We ought to treat the Bible with equal fairness. I decided long ago it was less difficult to believe that the Bible was what it claimed to be than to disbelieve it." See, the Bible contains the answers to our scientific questions, the answers to our spiritual questions, the answers to our physical questions. They're all in there. They're all complaining, if we're willing to look. They're all complete, but we got to look for it. When we look, though, we need to look with an open mind. Just like Abraham Lincoln, we need to choose to set aside our personal beliefs. We have to say, oh, if there's story in here, is generally true, everything that we've read about that we can verify is true, we have no reason not to believe the things that we can't verify today. And he chose. He said, everything that I've seen and that I can measure in this Bible I've seen to be true, so I have no reason not to believe the entire Bible. There's no reason not to believe Genesis, because everything else was true too. God tells us, if I have told you of earthly things and you do not believe, how will you believe if I tell you of heavenly things? If you do not believe Moses and the prophets, neither will you be persuaded though one arise from the dead. So God is our creator of this world. He created everything in it. And it's the foundation of not only our world, it's the foundation of the Bible. The very beginning, the very first thing God chose to share with us is that he is the creator of the heavens and the earth. He created this earth. He created it to be inhabited. He created it for us. And if we destroy that foundation, what can the righteous do? So the Bible has stated science laws and it stated facts long before they were ever verified. You know, evolutionary archaeologists use the Bible specifically to look for lost cities because they know the Bible is accurate. Even though they don't believe it, they know that all the information in there regarding where a city was located was more accurate than any other text they've ever been able to find. The Bible said the world was round. The Bible said the stars can't be counted. The Bible said that the physical laws, like the law of conservation energy, were stated in the Bible by Solomon. The Bible said that everything we see today is made up of things that we don't see. The Bible said everything that we see is made up by atoms, what we can't see. It stated that 3,000 years ago in some cases, and even longer. Everything that we've seen in the Bible, the list can go on and on and on. But the Bible also tells us about some prophecies. It tells us some prophecies of who Jesus is. You know, there's over 60 prophecies in the Bible concerning Jesus. 60 prophecies. There's over 60 prophecies, and every single one of those prophecies has been fulfilled by him. Every single one. Now, the odds of winning the lottery is approximately 1 in 100 million. The odds of just one person fulfilling 47 of these prophecies is 1 in 10 to the 157th power. You know what that number is? Keep watching. You'll see it. I'll wait. It takes a while. That's the odds of one person fulfilling those prophecies. But we have one man, one person in the name of Jesus Christ that fulfilled every single prophecy in the Bible. The Bible hasn't been proven to be wrong at any period in time in the history of this world. There are people that claim the Bible was wrong and people that have said they had evidence that supported that the Bible was wrong, but it was later found out that evidence wasn't right. And the Bible has never been chosen to be wrong. So just like Abraham Lincoln, as for me, I'll choose to believe the Bible to be true, the entire Bible to be true as a whole, because there's nothing I've found in the Bible that has not been true today, and the things that we don't have an answer for, I'll choose to believe. Just like Abraham Lincoln, there's no reason not to. So remember, we have a lot of evidence that was given to us, and there was a lot that was given to us in a very short period of time, both tonight and the previous nights. So if you do get an opportunity, we do have the videos that will be available. From what I understand, we can go onto the YouTube channel, West County SDA Church YouTube channel, and the videos will still be able to, so you can rewatch them again and again. But I want you to remember that the choice is yours. It's not anybody else's, but you have all the evidence before you make that choice. I want to thank you for coming.